Hollywood loves to pretend it was born in gold. Spotlights, sequins, the soft hum of applause. A city built to convince the world that beauty and goodness were the same thing. But behind those perfect smiles and technicolor dreams, there were shadows long, heavy, and deliberate. Behind every red carpet stood a curtain, and behind that curtain were the people who made America believe in its own reflection, while quietly deciding who deserved to be seen at all. They sold the world the idea of heroes, the fearless cowboy, the pure-hearted soldier, the charming gentleman. But off-screen, those same heroes whispered things that would curdle the light out of any frame. Because Hollywood's golden age wasn't gold. It was ivory, polished, spotless, and terrified of anything that wasn't white. This is not a story about scandal. It's about truth. A truth buried beneath awards, money, and myth. A truth the studios buried because it threatened the illusion that made them rich. 10 names. 10 legends. 10 untouchable icons whose words and actions still echo through the reels of history. They were loved. They were worshipped. And they were poisoned by an ugliness they tried to hide behind charm and genius. In a world obsessed with light, these were the shadows that shaped it.
One, Johnny Carson, the king who closed the door. He made America laugh. Night after night, his voice floated through the soft blue light of living rooms across the country. Johnny Carson, the man behind the desk, the smile, the suit. To the world, he was charm made human. The king of late night, a man so comfortable in his throne that the camera itself seemed to bend toward him. But behind that smile was a gate. And Carson, whether he admitted it or not, was the one who decided who was allowed to walk through it. He didn't shout, didn't spew venom. He didn't have to. His power was quieter than that. It was in the names he didn't invite, in the faces that never sat in his chair, in the stories America never got to hear. For 3 decades, his show was the pulse of American entertainment. If you were on Carson, you existed. If you weren't, you didn't. It was that simple. And in those years when the country was tearing itself apart, when marches filled the streets and the world began to change color, The Tonight Show stayed spotless. White suits, white smiles, white comfort. Carson's world was safe. And safety, in that America, meant silence. He didn't want to get political. That was what he said when asked why he rarely invited black performers who spoke about injustice, or why he turned away from artists who didn't fit his polished image of America. He said it like it was virtue, as though neutrality were kindness. But neutrality, in a burning house, is another word for permission. The truth was simple, and everyone in television knew it. Carson's producers had a list, unspoken, but understood. No one too radical, too outspoken, too uncomfortable. No one who might remind the audience that the laughter they loved was built on someone else's silence. Harry Belafonte, Nina Simone, Dick Gregory. People who used their voices, not just to sing or joke, but to reveal something raw about the world they lived in. They weren't banned, exactly. They were just never called, and that was how power worked. Those who did make it onto the stage learned the rules quickly. Smile. Keep it light. Make him laugh, not think. If you broke that rhythm, the room froze. Carson had that way of leaning back in his chair, his hands folded, that perfect smirk on his face. When he wasn't entertained, the silence was suffocating. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Disinterest. The kind that cuts deeper than cruelty, because it tells you that you don't matter. Behind the curtain, he was meticulous, distant. The staff called him private, but the truth was that he liked control. He liked order. He liked predictability. And anyone who didn't fit that rhythm, anyone who brought chaos, he called them uncontrolled. That word said everything. He wasn't a monster. He was worse. He was ordinary, polite. The kind of man who believed he was fair because he never said anything cruel. The kind who could destroy you without ever raising his voice. To his audience, he was a comfort, a familiar face that made the world feel steady again. But for countless artists standing on the outside, his show was a door they could never open. A door that defined who was seen and who stayed invisible. And when he finally retired in 1992, America wept. Millions mourned a friend they never met. But for others, for those who had been erased, ignored, left waiting in studio lobbies, it wasn't an ending. It was release. Because Johnny Carson didn't just make people laugh. He made sure some people were never heard. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to hate. He just needed to smile. And every time he did, the world thanked him for it. To John Wayne, the hero who worshipped white supremacy. He was the image of America itself, tall, rugged, righteous. A cowboy carved from sunlight and dust. John Wayne. To millions, he was the very idea of what a man should be. Strong, fearless, pure. He didn't just play heroes, he embodied them. Or at least, that's what Hollywood told the world to believe. But behind the myth of the man on horseback was something darker. Something harder to look at than any western sunset. Because John Wayne, the face of America's moral code, spent his life defending a version of the country that only existed for men like him. He once said in a 1971 interview that he believed in white supremacy, not as a whisper, not as a mistake, but as a conviction, delivered calmly, as if it were simple fact. He said he didn't feel guilty about what had been done to Native Americans, that they had been selfishly trying to keep the land. He said that black people weren't ready for equality. He said it all with the same voice he used in every movie. Steady, confident, American. The tragedy of John Wayne wasn't just what he said. It was how easy it was for people to forgive him for it. Because America wanted him to be the hero. And heroes don't have flaws. They have excuses. When the Playboy interview came out, it caused a stir, yes, but not a reckoning. For most of the country, Wayne's words were brushed aside, explained away as a man of his time. But time doesn't make cruelty disappear. It just hides it in the applause. The industry still celebrated him. Directors still begged him to star in films. The Academy still gave him awards. He was too big to be questioned, too American to be wrong. And so the myth continued. The good man with a gun. The white savior who brought justice to a world that was only ever seen through his eyes. But for the people who grew up watching him, the ones who never got to be the hero, the ones who only appeared in the background of his movies as caricatures, as savages, as jokes, the damage was permanent. Because John Wayne's America became everyone's America. Even decades later, when young actors of color entered the industry, they still felt the shadow of his myth, the demand to be polite, unthreatening, grateful for any role that didn't mock them outright. Wayne had helped build that system. And Hollywood, for all its progress, still hasn't completely torn it down. He died in 1979, a legend wrapped in patriotism, a man honored for embodying the nation's ideals. But the truth was simpler and sadder. John Wayne didn't represent America at its best. He represented what America wanted to believe about itself, a country that conquered, controlled, and called it destiny. And maybe that's why his image still stands tall on movie posters, even as the world learns to see him differently. Because myths are hard to kill, especially when they were born out of the very lies that built the dream itself. He rode into history as a hero, but he left behind a silence that still echoes, a silence that reminds us how easy it is to cheer for the villain, when the villain looks like the story we've always wanted to tell. 3. Clark Gable, the gentleman of hatred. He was called the King of Hollywood. Clark Gable, the smile, the charm, the man who could make every line sound like a promise. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. He was the perfect gentleman on screen, the embodiment of class and confidence. But in the shadows of that perfection was a different kind of man, one who wore his privilege like a crown and never questioned who paid the price for his power. Gable came from a world that taught him what success looked like, and success in his world was white, male, and untouchable. He rose through Hollywood's golden age like a god in a tailored suit, and he learned early that image was everything. That if you smiled right, talked soft, and stayed out of politics, you could be loved forever. And Gable wanted to be loved, even if it meant pretending not to see what was right in front of him. When Gone with the Wind premiered in 1939, the world hailed it as the most beautiful film ever made. It was a masterpiece of cinema and a lie about history. A love letter to the Old South. A fantasy where slavery was softened into nostalgia and cruelty was disguised as heritage. Hattie McDaniel, the first black woman to win an Academy Award, played the role of Mammy, a caricature dressed up as affection. She was barred from attending the Atlanta premiere because of segregation laws. And when she finally received her Oscar, she wasn't allowed to sit with her white co-stars at the ceremony. Clark Gable said nothing. The man who could charm a nation into laughter said nothing. Not a protest, not a refusal, not even a word of defense. He went to the premiere. He smiled for the cameras. He played his part, even when it was silence. It wasn't that he didn't see. It was that he chose not to. Because to see would have meant to act. And acting against the system that made him a god would have meant losing everything that came with it. Years later, people would try to defend him. They'd say he was kind to his co-stars, that he treated Hattie with respect, that he didn't share the prejudice of others. Maybe he didn't. But silence has its own language. And in that language, Gable spoke fluently. He was part of a Hollywood that believed progress was bad for business, that the illusion mattered more than the truth. He didn't invent that idea, but he helped keep it alive, with every smile, every handshake, every role that made the lie look beautiful. When he died in 1960, they called him a legend. They called him the king, and maybe he was. But what he ruled wasn't art, and it wasn't truth. It was comfort. The kind that makes people forget. The kind that keeps them from asking why. Clark Gable was never the villain in his own story. He didn't need to be. He was the man who stood in the center of the room while the world around him burned, and convinced everyone it was only candlelight. 4. James Stewart, the good man's cruel silence. He was the man America trusted most. James Stewart, tall, gentle, the everyman hero. He wasn't just a movie star. He was a symbol of decency. The man who could look straight into the camera and make you believe in goodness again. From Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to It's a Wonderful Life, he became the face of morality itself, honesty wrapped in charm. But James Stewart's goodness lived mostly on film. Off screen, he was a different kind of patriot. Not cruel, not violent. Just quietly complicit. The kind of man who didn't need to shout his beliefs because the world already agreed with him. He came from a conservative town in Pennsylvania, and he carried that world with him everywhere he went. Discipline, tradition, order. He fought in World War II, became a decorated pilot, and returned a hero. But war doesn't just build heroes, it also builds walls. Stewart came back believing in the America he had fought for, and in his mind, that America didn't include everyone. In Hollywood, he kept his politics polite. He didn't use slurs or shout opinions. He didn't have to. His silence spoke for him. When the civil rights movement began to shake the country, when actors began using their fame to speak out, Stewart stayed still. He never marched, never protested, never lent his voice to those fighting for equality. He didn't oppose them, he said. He simply stayed out of it. But neutrality in moments of injustice is its own kind of betrayal. Because when men like James Stewart stayed quiet, the system stayed strong. He was friends with John Wayne, a man who wore his prejudice proudly. They shared stages, conversations, and admiration. Two American icons agreeing on what America should look like. In the 1950s, when Hollywood blacklisted artists accused of having communist sympathies, Stewart didn't question the hysteria. He supported it. He believed that America needed protection from dangerous ideas, even when those ideas were nothing more than freedom, art, or truth. And so the man who played the voice of conscience on screen became another quiet enforcer of the silence off it. People loved him because he seemed kind. And maybe he was, to those who could afford his version of kindness. To those who didn't challenge his world or his comfort. To those who fit inside his definition of good people. When he grew old, he was revered, almost saintly. The industry celebrated him as one of the last pure souls of Hollywood. But purity is a myth, and innocence is a privilege. James Stewart was both a product and protector of a world that demanded goodness from some and obedience from others. He didn't need to be hateful to cause harm. All he had to do was nothing. And in the story of America, sometimes the quietest men help the noise last the longest. 5. Gary Cooper, the patriot poisoned by prejudice. He was the cowboy who never raised his voice, the soldier who never lost his honor, the man who made courage look effortless. Gary Cooper, tall, polite, and unshakably American. If John Wayne was the fist, Cooper was the face, the calm, noble symbol of what Hollywood wanted every man to be. He built his career playing heroes who stood for justice. But off-screen, his sense of justice had limits. Because Cooper's America wasn't the one written in ideals. It was the one drawn in borders. And inside those borders, he believed certain people simply didn't belong. He hated change. He said so often in letters, in quiet interviews, in conversations behind closed doors. He believed America had been better before all the noise, before new voices demanded space in the story. To him, equality was chaos, and progress looked too much like rebellion. In the late 1940s, as the country began its witch hunt against anyone labeled a communist, Gary Cooper didn't just go along with it. He stood at the front. He testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, telling Congress that Hollywood was being infected by dangerous ideas. He named names. Writers, actors, men and women, whose only crime was thinking differently. He said he didn't know any communists personally, but if he did, he wouldn't work with them. That one sentence was enough to ruin careers. For many, it was enough to end lives. Because in those years, accusation was guilt. And the voice of a movie star carried more weight than truth itself. Cooper called it patriotism. The country called it loyalty. But what it really was fear the kind that hides behind flags and prayers. He kept his distance from the civil rights movement. When asked about it, he shrugged, said he wasn't political. But neutrality was always the excuse of men who didn't have to fight for anything. He liked his world simple. White hats, black hats. Good guys, bad guys. And like so many of his generation, he never realized that he'd been cast on the wrong side of history. His films were loved for their morality, for the quiet man who stands alone against corruption. But the irony was cruel. Because when the real corruption came, Gary Cooper stood with it. Not out of malice, but because that was what men like him were built to do. Protect the world that made them gods. He died a hero in the public eye. The studios called him noble, humble, decent. And maybe he was, in his own narrow way. But morality, when it serves only comfort, isn't goodness. It's cowardice dressed in respectability. Gary Cooper played America's conscience on screen. Off screen, he was just another man who mistook silence for virtue and obedience for strength. He didn't invent that version of patriotism. He just made it look beautiful enough for everyone else to believe in it. 6. Vivien Leigh, the Scarlet Shadow. She was elegance incarnate, her face luminous enough to stop time. Vivien Leigh, the woman who became Scarlett O'Hara, the face of beauty, tragedy, and obsession all at once. For decades, audiences worshipped her. They called her timeless, brilliant, perfect. But behind those flawless features and her fragile voice was a heart steeped in the same poison that ran through the very film that made her immortal. Vivien Leigh was British educated, precise, trained in the discipline of classical theater. But Hollywood reshaped her into something else. The Southern Belle, the symbol of a world that never existed, a fantasy stitched together with racism and romance. And she embraced it, not just the role, but everything it represented. When Gone with the Wind was being filmed, Vivien studied plantation life to make Scarlett authentic. She read the scripts that reduced black people to caricatures, that turned slavery into a backdrop for beauty. She read the lines, saw the cruelty written between them, and said nothing. Hattie McDaniel, her co-star, was forced to use a separate entrance at the premiere. She couldn't stay in the same hotel, couldn't sit beside her castmates. Vivian knew this. She didn't protest. She didn't walk out. She smiled for the cameras, arm in arm with the white men who made the movie. And the world applauded her grace. The irony of Gone with the Wind is that it was a story about loss, about a dying way of life. And Vivien Leigh, in her own way, became its perfect messenger. She mourned that illusion. She played it beautifully. And through her performance, she gave nostalgia to a lie that still refuses to die. She would later speak about the role, saying it had haunted her. But she never confronted what it represented. She blamed the obsession on fame, on the weight of playing a legend, never on the history that legend defended. Vivien lived much of her life in illness, her mental health fragile, her body frail. And in that fragility, people found another excuse to forgive her silence. They said she wasn't political, she was delicate. They said she didn't understand the world beyond her roles. But she did. She just preferred the version of it that adored her. Hollywood protected her as it protects all its icons. It wrote her tragedy as romance, a woman too sensitive for her own brilliance. But beneath that narrative was a simpler truth. She was a product of a system that rewarded beauty over conscience. A woman praised for embodying a lie so gracefully that no one dared ask what it cost. When she died in 1967, they called her a goddess. They said she had brought dignity to the South. And maybe she did, if dignity means making people forget what the South really was. Vivien Leigh never needed to hate out loud. Her silence was enough. Her beauty did the rest. She became the face of nostalgia for an empire built on pain. And for that, history will always remember her, not just as Scarlett O'Hara, but as the woman who made the lie unforgettable. 7. Katharine Hepburn, the feminist who built a wall. She was fire in human form. Sharp voice, iron posture, unyielding will. Katharine Hepburn, the woman who never asked for permission, who wore trousers when Hollywood demanded skirts, who spoke like she was born allergic to submission. For generations, she was the symbol of independence, the woman who refused to belong to anyone. But independence, in her world, had borders. And her rebellion, as radical as it looked, was built safely within the boundaries of privilege. Hepburn didn't break the system. She thrived inside it. She mocked the actresses who posed for men, but her own defiance came wrapped in money and lineage. Born into comfort, educated in elite schools, she had the luxury of pretending that her freedom was universal. It wasn't. She called herself a feminist before the word was fashionable. But her feminism rarely reached beyond her own reflection. When asked about other women in Hollywood, the secretaries, the extras, the maids who worked without credit or dignity, she dismissed them as weak. She said, "If you want freedom, take it." But she never acknowledged that some women weren't allowed to. Her defiance made her an icon. She refused to marry again after Spencer Tracy, refused to play submissive roles, refused to let men dictate her career. But her rebellion never included solidarity. She never used her power to lift the women who had none. She never lent her voice to the movements that fought for equality beyond the studio gates. When the civil rights movement roared through America, she stayed silent. When black actresses were barred from major roles, she didn't speak up. She called herself apolitical, as if silence were the mark of sophistication. In interviews, she laughed about her reputation. Cold, unapproachable, arrogant. She liked those words. They made her sound strong. But strength without empathy becomes isolation. And that was what Hepburn built around herself. A wall of self-sufficiency so thick that even truth couldn't climb over it. People loved her because she didn't care what they thought. She moved through the world like a storm that answered to no one. But she also ignored everything that didn't touch her. Her rebellion was clean. A rebellion without risk. When she grew old, Hollywood crowned her its queen, the grand dame of American cinema. 4 Oscars, countless tributes, a lifetime of applause for refusing to bend. But the truth is quieter. Katharine Hepburn changed what a woman could look like on screen, but not what a woman could be off it. Her defiance stopped at the edge of her own comfort. And in the end, her strength became its own kind of blindness. Proof that you can challenge the rules, without ever questioning who wrote them. She spent her life standing alone, and Hollywood rewarded her for it. Because in a world built on control, nothing is safer than a rebel who never shares her throne. 8. Marlon Brando, the two-faced revolutionary. He was chaos and beauty in the same breath. Marlon Brando, the man who changed acting forever, who tore the mask off Hollywood's polished heroes and showed the raw, trembling soul underneath. He was the rebel who refused to play the game, the artist who demanded truth in a town built on lies. But Brando's truth was selective. He talked about justice, about race, about the cruelty of the system. And yet, in his own life, he carried the same arrogance as the men he condemned. Brando was fascinated by rebellion. He made it his identity. He supported the civil rights movement, marched with Martin Luther King Jr., refused an Oscar to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. He was the voice of conscience in a business that rarely had one. But even revolutionaries can be hypocrites. Off-screen, he treated people like they were experiments, friends, lovers, colleagues. He believed in empathy, but only when it made him feel powerful. He lectured about equality while humiliating those closest to him. He spoke about peace while leaving destruction in every relationship he touched. He loved to call out racism in others, but he never faced his own cruelty. He used the pain of others as material, their trauma as texture for his art. And when he stood in front of microphones preaching compassion, he always made sure the spotlight still belonged to him. There's a story from the early 1970s, Brando lecturing a Native American activist backstage, telling her how she should speak, how she should behave, how to be angry the right way. She listened in silence and said, "You talk like the people you say you hate." He laughed. Because he couldn't see it. He was too addicted to being the savior. That's the tragedy of Brando. He wanted to destroy Hollywood, but only after it had worshipped him first. He was the mirror and the monster at once, the man who told the truth, but never lived it. When he refused his Oscar for The Godfather, the world called it bravery. And it was. But it was also theater, a performance inside the man who claimed to despise performances. His message was righteous, but his ego was always louder. He fought against the industry's racism, but he never gave up the privileges it gave him. He spoke for the voiceless, but only in his voice. And yet, for all his contradictions, he left something behind that mattered, a challenge. He forced Hollywood to see itself. He forced it to admit that beneath the golden image was something rotten and human and hungry. Marlon Brando was both prophet and parasite, the man who wanted to save the world, but couldn't save himself. He was living proof that rebellion without humility is just another performance, another mask, another beautiful lie in a city built on them. 9. Bing Crosby. The voice of Christmas and cruelty, he was warmth itself. That smooth baritone voice, the kind that wrapped around America like a blanket. Bing Crosby, the sound of Christmas. The man who turned nostalgia into music, who gave a nation comfort when it needed it most. He sang about home, family, and peace. And for millions, he became the very definition of kindness. But the voice that soothed the world was the same one that terrified his children. Behind closed doors, the beloved crooner of holiday dreams was a man of discipline so cold it froze everything it touched. Crosby believed in control. He built his family the way he built his career, with strictness, silence, and fear. He demanded perfection from his sons, the same way he demanded it from himself. When they failed, he punished them with words sharp enough to scar. In public, he smiled. He joked. He charmed. He radiated serenity. But at home, that serenity became cruelty, an obsession with order, a refusal to show softness, a belief that love had to be earned through obedience. Decades later, when his children began to speak, the image of America's kindest man cracked open. His son Gary wrote a memoir describing the world behind that famous grin, a house full of silence and shame. He wrote, "We were not allowed to be children. We were soldiers in my father's private war." Crosby's response was as polished as ever. He dismissed the pain, called it exaggeration, and went back to singing about peace on earth. And the world let him. Because no one wanted to believe the truth about a man who made them feel safe. That was Bing Crosby's real power. He understood that if you sound gentle enough, people will forgive anything. The same system that celebrated him refused to question what he was when the cameras turned off. Because Hollywood loves contradictions, as long as they make money. He performed innocence for decades, a one-man industry of comfort and nostalgia. And in doing so, he taught America something dangerous, that cruelty could be hidden behind charm, that abuse could wear a tuxedo, and that a smile could sound like forgiveness. He died in 1977, midway through a game of golf in Spain. His last words reportedly lighthearted. "That was a great game, fellas." The newspapers called it poetic, the peaceful end of a peaceful man. But there was nothing peaceful about the silence he left behind. Bing Crosby's voice still plays every December, floating through stores, radios, and living rooms, reminding everyone of simpler times. But those times were only simple for some. For others, they were a prison wrapped in melody. He was the voice of comfort to the world, and the sound of fear to his own children. And perhaps that's what makes him the truest symbol of old Hollywood, a man who made the world believe in peace, while never finding any for himself. 10. Walt Disney, the magic built on darkness. He was the architect of dreams. Walt Disney, the man who taught the world to believe in magic. He built castles out of imagination, kingdoms out of fantasy, and convinced generations that innocence could conquer anything. To millions, he was a father figure of wonder, a man who gave the world color after decades of war and fear. But behind the smile and the cartoons, behind the fireworks and the fairy tales, was a man who saw the world not as it was, but as he wanted it to be. And that vision was not kind to everyone. Disney's America was spotless. Perfect lawns, perfect families, perfect smiles. He sold the fantasy of purity, a country without conflict, a world without difference. And to maintain that illusion, he erased anything that didn't fit inside it. He was a visionary, yes, but his vision came with rules. He demanded loyalty, purity, obedience. He was known for firing animators who questioned him, for monitoring their private lives, for punishing artists who joined unions. To him, dissent wasn't creativity, it was betrayal. During the Red Scare, Disney testified before Congress, naming employees he suspected of communist sympathies. He told the government that subversive elements were infiltrating his studio. He handed over the names of artists whose only crime was wanting fair pay for their work. He called it patriotism, the same word others use to justify cruelty. But his control went deeper than politics. It was ideological. His cartoons, his parks, his films, they all told the same story. The world is simple. Good always wins. And villains are easy to spot. But the real world isn't a fairy tale. And Walt Disney made sure his audiences never had to face that truth. He built Disneyland as a utopia. But the rules were clear even there. In its early years, people of color weren't allowed to hold certain jobs inside the park. Every cast member had to maintain a clean-cut appearance, a phrase that meant more than grooming. It meant conformity. It meant whiteness as the default of decency. Disney saw himself as a father of a nation, a man shaping moral values through imagination. But imagination, when policed, becomes propaganda. And that's what his magic often was, a beautiful illusion that told people what to believe. The world adored him for it. Presidents praised him. The media called him a genius. Even now, his name is synonymous with childhood itself. But behind that legacy is the cost of control, the erasure of the messy, complex truths that make us human. Walt Disney didn't invent America's nostalgia. He perfected it. He turned it into an empire, a kingdom where the past was cleaner, the future safer, and the present something to be ignored. He died in 1966, still dreaming of a city Epcot, a planned, controlled community he wanted to build in Florida. He called it the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. It was to be a place without poverty, crime, or chaos. But underneath that promise was his same obsession, a world without difference, a perfect world that could never exist without erasing what made it real. Walt Disney's empire outlived him. The castles grew taller, the illusions brighter. But the foundation remains the same, a fantasy built on control, a dream sold as truth. He gave the world its happiest place. But even happiness, when built on silence, casts a long and permanent shadow.